victimhood extends beyond her, because she lives not just for her, not just her, but resulting from the forced marriage, resulting from the forced pregnancy. There are children born out of war, and these are her children. And in the African society, unlike, I think, in the Western system, where, for example, you can separate and distinguish social from legal rights. Now, if you take as an example, Avocats Sans Frontières works a lot on property rights. Now, property rights are very intricate in marriage. You attain it from birth, from marriage, divorce, separation, so everything is around family. So these women and girls have been in a situation where they're forced into marriage, forced into pregnancies. How do we legally define them when it comes to property rights? Where do they start? So all of those are injustices that you cannot define, for example, in one single way to be able to assess and say, how do we design a system? What works and what doesn't work? So to that extent, if getting back to the question to say what has worked or what should work or what might work, I think I would throw back the question to us and say, do our frameworks and systems provide an opportunity to understand these injustices? Sarah talked about the ICC providing all of this jurisprudence, and Professor hinted about from Nuremberg to ICTY to ICTR, and now we have it in the Rome Statute. Now, domestically, does our legal framework, for example, understand these injustices? If we do not understand, if we don't listen to the voices of these women, and for me, the starting point would be, where are the women, where are the girls in lawmaking? Because before you come up with a framework, before you come up with a policy, you need to appreciate what are you addressing. And so I think to this extent, what works is to first understand the victims and survivors, listen to their voices. What is it that they are going through? Because sometimes we think we defined injustice from a very legal perspective. But when you speak to these victims, you actually realize that they have a feeling of wrongness. Someone has done wrong to me. Someone has made me feel bad. But when we get this wrongness that they perceive, it doesn't fit in our legal framework completely. It's out of the legal framework. And so even when you take their cases to court, they're still waiting for justice. In your opinion, you actually aid in justice, but the victim is waiting for justice. There is a constant feeling of I have been wronged, a constant feeling of wrongness that they continue to grapple with. So for me, I think is to call upon us to first appreciate what these victims go through. And like we've said, we have a framework both at the national and at the international level. But when it comes to access to justice in a context of transitional justice, there's a uniqueness that comes with it, where you look at, for example, legal empowerment as starting from economic empowerment. Economic empowerment becomes a lever towards legal empowerment. And we often question and say, if you want to provide justice, empower the people legally, sensitize them, tell them you have rights, tell them you can go to court, tell them the court is open, and also assure them that the courts are impartial. That is only one means. It is you telling them about a framework that they consider very ideal to them. But the second one is, what is the enabler? How does this woman or girl access this justice? Beyond the knowledge, she needs the means. And what is the means? The means are often, are the courts accessible? And what is accessibility? It is financial accessibility, in addition, of course, to knowledge and geographical. And so that is why I think for many civil society actors, we're looking at economic empowerment as a lever towards legal empowerment. That let's empower these women economically so they are able to walk towards their justice path. But also not only have programs that look at their legal or economic empowerment. How about psychosocial support? because they've been wronged in so many ways. And for me, from experience, in designing some of these programs, it is a hybrid. You cannot delink one from the other. So there's need for a more holistic approach and an opportunity to actually create a program that starts from understanding the woman, creating the systems, but even that when that justice or the perceived justice has been given to her, there's the so what. You know, because we are impacted also by a lot of, like I said earlier, with the patriarchal culture, we are impacted by a lot of cultures around where these women live. Who do you involve? Oftentimes, I think when we went to law school, and it's really, I hope that we went to law school a couple of years ago. I'm hoping that the students that are in law school now, when we talk about justice, they're thinking about both the formal and the informal justice. When I went to law school, we were taken through the statutes, the Constitution, and when a traditional leader comes to you and says, I am supposed to dispense justice, often your first question is, who are you? Which law school did you go to? You know, what statute are you quoting from? What article of the Constitution? That is your justice, and that is not the justice of the person that is seeking justice. So for me, let's have both the formal and the informal. That is holistic justice. It is not only physical accessibility or financial accessibility, it is also cultural appropriate and comfortable accessibility, because this is a sense of wrongdoing. And I'll end with a very, very practical example that I was faced with. At the very beginning of my career, and this was a woman, a victim or a survivor, returned from war. She returned from war and, of course, re-accessed her ancestral home. But when she got there, her brothers-in-law, because when she left, she was married. So lucky enough for her, she didn't stay for long, so she wasn't remarried or did not have any children while in captivity. But when she came back, she has a right to her sexual and reproductive health rights. So she found herself a new boyfriend that she went along with to her pre-displacement home. And the cultural leader said, you need to leave, and so did her brothers-in-law do that. The legal system, our very formal legal system would say, this woman has a right. But culturally, she only has a right when she's unaccompanied by the new intruder into this home. Now, if you exclude the informal justice system, you will never come to a solution that is adaptable, that is appropriate. Our legal framework in Uganda, at least, enables us and appreciates that we have a dynamic justice system, we have the imposed justice system, and we have our customary justice system. And I like to call the Constitution a winnower. It creates a check and balance that you can respect your culture and go by cultural values and norms and customary law, in as long as it does not contradict the constitutional values of non-discrimination, protecting rights of women, children, persons with disability. So I think I would like to end with that. I hope I have saved time for the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. You stuck within your time. Thank you for that. And also, we've heard Doctor re-emphasize the need for victim-centered, culturally sensitive access to justice approaches as we go forward, and the need to understand the contexts within which we are operating in Uganda, but also in Africa as a whole, looking at the specificities and the effects of war on individuals and their families. This takes us to our next speaker, Stephen, who works with actually individuals and has been participating in peace building. Stephen, could you please tell us the tools that could work to help survivors to combat impunity, human rights violations, and how we can mitigate gender-based violence?
Thank you, the moderator. I think I appreciate you for walking me first up and letting me speak last, because my co-panelists have exhausted part of the question they asked. I think practically, as a victim and as somebody who had also, over the years, have worked with the victims and for the victims, I want to appreciate the last speaker. I think many of us have been thinking and speaking academically. We have not learned or lived the very language we are trying to speak here, called victims or survivors and so on, of different violations, whether of war, whether of different human rights violations. As a victim, one thing that I want to say is that we've been left aside when people speak justice. When people are talking conflict mitigations and so on, victims have never been consulted. When you move to communities, for example, in northern Uganda, and even Rwenzori, where some of us have had time to visit, some of the terms we are talking about here, some of the issues we are trying to reflect, are new to them. My colleague here, the two colleagues here on my left, both work for NGOs in this country, and I've had time to visit communities. The only thing that I would want to first say is, when it comes to the face of the victims, where we want to speak justice, we first have to appreciate the fact that they have suffered, they have undergone atrocities, that it is even hard to narrate. Some of them, up to now, have failed to even literally tell their stories, what they went through. The only call in their life is we need justice. And this justice is coming from a perspective of tangibilities. They don't want to see these issues of, even many, of course, we've heard recently when Thomas Koyer was convicted here at Uganda court at the ICD. And even when Dominic Ongwen was convicted, many jubilated over his convictions. But some of the victims that we interact with them during actually in different platforms, including what Scott was talking about, radio programs and one-on-one community visits, are saying, victim Ongwen has been convicted and maybe sentenced, so what? What do I gain? I'm one of the person that Ongwen tortured. Ongwen left me without my children. Ongwen left me without my hands, or my arms have been amputated. So at the end of the day, the question is, what is justice to them? So what are the way forward for these people? Many of them are just, when Scott visited northern Uganda recently, the question that he came back with, some of them are unanswerable. They're asking him, okay, you are coordinating the trust fund for victims. Now we've had the announcement of reparations. What is our expectations? Are you coming to start payment to the victims tomorrow? Is it next year? This an old person comes to you and say, my son, I'm dying. Scott is here. I am dying. I don't think I can even reach 2025. What are you talking about? So working with these people and working for them over the years has made some of us victims of the circumstance. We have for years been in addressing the physical conditions of these victims, the physical healing, as Scott talked about, the rehabilitation. They say, I have bomb splinters in my body, I cannot go to the garden. I don't know what you're talking about, economic empowerment. You cannot talk about economic empowerment to somebody who has pains. This person has bomb splinters, has bullets in their bodies. It has never been removed. And some of them are in complicated places and tell you this requires specialized facility, which is not in northern Uganda. And some of the NGOs operating in the region cannot even afford the medical expenses to some of the victims they're trying to support. So in the end, the victims are still left yearning. I want you to let this come clear to you that when we want to talk about the issues of the victims, I do believe it is a similar occasion in some of the victims from other sub-Saharan Africa, like from DRC and other places, even from Sudan. Their plights are not very far away from what we have experienced in Uganda. Particularly, when we want to talk about the face of the victims in what we do every day, there's one thing that Sarah one time said, how victim-centered have been your thinking as a member of the civil society organization? How victim-centered have been your programming? Do you look at victims in every penny that comes to the organization? For example, you receive donation. Do you see the victim face in them? Do you see that as this money gets off, the victim's plight, the victim's needs partially could have been addressed? It cannot be very wholly, but at least partially could have been addressed. So these had been some of the thinking that some of us think every other day. I want to say that we are surrounded by refugees. We talked about the returns of people to their communities, and we are hosting thousands and thousands of refugees from the bordering countries. Do you know we are arching into another war in the sub-region? There are underlying issues and questions and tension and violations happening after every other night in this particular sub-region where we are coming from, particularly in northern Uganda, where we are hosting so many refugees. We have been left to battle with them. Opportunities and government programming that is tailored to help facilitate the well-being of the refugees move either at night or at day, but directly to the refugee settlements. How much have the community, the host community, been involved in supporting the very refugees that we are hosting? Some of them have started fighting with these refugees. They're saying, you are benefiting on our behalf in our own land. And some of these questions have been left unaddressed, which is the question of accountability. So to many who still think the issue of the victims remains maybe within the academic perspective, the reality on the ground is different. Freshly, 2 months ago, there was a lot of rising internal conflicts between the host communities and refugees in the West Nile sub-region. So all we are supposed to do is, as the NGO workers in the sub-region, we are all trying to address the needs of the host communities vis-à-vis the presence of the refugees. Meanwhile, we run to them, to the refugees, to say we need to do this for them, we need to support them in doing this and that. We have created another violence and war internally brewing between the refugees and the host communities in northern Uganda. So as victims, people want to see the physical happenings. You want to talk about the physical support. People want to see what supports already their damaged life. How will I live in the next years? I have children, I have siblings, I have grandchildren, whom I am the pillar to them. How do I move in the next 5, 10 years? How do I support them? So as a victim, I want to say we have in many ways been talked about, but left alone. When it comes to our needs as victims, we have been left. But they speak well about us. We hear about victim issues, victim this and that. That's why I was so appreciative to Scott. He had been one of the persons who had been very practical in the field. Scott just doesn't move to go to Gulu or go to Lera or go to Kitgum or the other side. He goes down to the ground and finds out, hears for himself what the victims are all saying, what the victims' needs are, and what needs to be addressed. I want to hint issues of accountability. For us, we sometimes, maybe for the accountants, they might think accountability is paperwork. You issue me money, you want to see me sign, and so on. The accountability we are talking about in terms of the victims are far beyond issues of the mere accountability, which is paperwork. We talked about accountability. We wanted to see what has the perpetrators gone through. Many of us have seen perpetrators doing better than us. And we ask ourselves, should we also be perpetrators? So that we benefit, because they think they're doing well, they're doing better than the victims themselves.